is Christ incarnating in the world then? Because what I'm really interested in these old stories, these sacred texts, is it a story that happened? It is a story that happened back then, but is it a story that's happening right now? And I think the only reason we still tell these stories is because it uncovers or exhumes the story we're still in that's similar to what we see these ancient peoples go through. Yeah. People who lived in a very different world.
Welcome to this special episode of the Upwards podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Johnson. Using this passion and commitment to craft, Scott Erickson has been a working artist for over a decade and had his work appear on CNN, National Geographic, and various magazines, newspaper outlets, and book covers. On this episode, I sit down with Scott Erickson, a painter, an artist, author, and speaker, to explore his book, Honest Advent. It is a beautiful and sincere 25-day Advent devotional focused on the deity and the humanity of the Christmas story. You can find out more about his work in the Honest Advent devotional and the links in the description. Please enjoy my conversation with Scott Erickson. The genesis of writing like this, how did you come across, think about Advent as kind of the launch of kind of really your writing career?
Yeah. Well, I am married and I have 3 kids. And so the joke is like, I'm not a woman, but I'm married to one. And we were pregnant with our 3rd. So I've witnessed firsthand, close adjacent, 3 pregnancies and 3 births. And it was a year, although different headlines, very similar, conflicts around the world, refugees, pandemics, illnesses, polarizing political stuff. And I remember walking into a CVS and going, oh, it's Christmas. It's like November. It's like, oh yeah, Christmas, because everything is decorated for Christmas. And just going, man, none of this feels like it has anything to do with the world I live in. And that really was like the question that started in me, was just like, yeah, does it? Is this because I love the brand of Christmas. I love the music and the colors and the whole feel. I think it's a brand. It's what it is. It's been building over decades, but it's like a whole thing. But I was like, is this just a distraction from reality, or is this a message of hope for reality? And what is that? What is that message of hope? And then I think the deeper question was, is Jesus incarnating in the world just something that happened 2,000 years ago, or is it still happening today? Like, is it a memorial service or is it a birthday party? Because if it's a memorial service, then great. I'm glad that happened back then. Hurrah. But if it's a birthday party, that means it's still going on. And if you ask any kid at a pageant at a church who's dressed like a shepherd, whose birthday is it? They'll be like, it's Jesus. So it's a birthday party. So I was like, well, where is Christ incarnating in the world then? Because what I'm really interested in these old stories, these sacred texts, is it a story that happened? It is a story that happened back then, but is it a story that's happening right now? And I think the only reason we still tell these stories is because it uncovers or exhumes the story we're still in that's similar to what we see these ancient peoples go through. Yeah. People who lived in a very different world. And as I started, and then so then I had these questions, and then I looked at what my wife was going through, and I was like, pregnancy is magical and beautiful, but it's also really like painful and uncomfortable, a lot of bodily fluids, and it's very vulnerable, the whole process. Yeah. And what really got me was like, oh, if Jesus came into the world just like all of us have, which was through human vulnerability, and if we're going to find Christ incarnating in the world, it's probably going to be in the same way, through human vulnerability. So is that filter that kind of like caused me to, my curiosity and my passion and my desire to know God so it went into that. When a question comes up, it's an invitation to know something. And so and then as an artist, I'm like Hamilton. I wrote my way out. No, I drew my way out. You know, I'm like, what are these images? And I was like, oh, I need to make something that doesn't look anything like snowfall and cabins and even
Hallmark stuff, right? Yeah.
Even, and I don't mind being called a Christian artist, but like, I'm not a Bible illustrator, you know, like I'm not here to make women and men in flowing robes, like, because I know historically we can build a case archaeologically because of like amphora vases and leftover mosaics, but like nobody knows what it looked like back then. Whatever you think it looks like is something is made up. And so it's all invented. So I was just like, well, I can make up my own vocabulary for this. And so the book, if you see it, it doesn't look like Christmas at all. Like in a Christmas section, you're like, that book doesn't look like it should be here, because it's like very on purpose to not be any of that brand. It's like, no, this is like a story. Anyways, that's kind of all came. And I started posting the stuff on Instagram, and the responses, mostly from men, but also women, were just really encouraging, especially since, you know, I'm not like, for me, I'm like a guest in the house, you know, I'm not a mom. I'm a parent, but I'm not, a lot of this biology is in a woman's body. And so, for me to then depict not sexually, but like, you know, very biologically, like here's a female body, here's what they're going through. This is where the divine happening was happening. It was just wonderful to hear women go, man, I feel so honored and seen by these illustrations, by these meditations. And that gave me a lot of joy, because that's all I was trying to do, was just going,
so the art form.
I see you, and it's what you're going through is a miracle. A wonder.
So the art form, I mean, the paintings, the arts started first, and then the book kind of came out of these paintings, drawings that were happening.
I did like 5 meditations the first year, and I think I did like 5 more, and then I did like 7 more. And then by that 3rd year, I was like, oh, there's like a book here. If I just did like a few more, we do 25 days. And was there
one that you did, a piece of art that you did, that you are like, whoa, that connected to me in a way that maybe some of the other pieces didn't? Or was there one specific or a couple specific that just really kind of jumped out of the page spiritually, formationally for you? I mean, it's a powerful tool for, I think, the people that are engaging with it, right? As you look through it and see these beautiful images that are wondering, as the artist, how did that, like, were there certain ones that just formed you or wowed you, or, you know, you were taken aback by kind of the expression that was being produced?
Yeah, I mean, it's not very often, even though I'm a maker of stuff. I mean, you always need to push your own line of what's cliche. You know, you make something and you go, it could be better, and you do it again and again and again. I'm like designing a book cover right now, and I'm like literally cutting out fonts out of paper, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to do this a lot of times to get to. It's just a lot of trying. Yeah, so I think there was one image. When you're at a pregnancy, when you're at a birth, you're so filled with like adrenaline, and you're tired that I don't think you're really aware of what's happening.
Yeah.
But when I went back and I was like, oh, what do births really look like? You'd be surprised the amount of births people have put on YouTube. And when you watch those videos without the adrenaline and without the exhaustion, you're like, like I got sick. Like I was like, oh man, it's a lot of stuff, a lot of fluids. And but there's this one image that I have of this woman who's kind of on her knees, and she's done just kind of, you know, like a home birth. And then she has her baby. It's under the chapter Breaking. And she's just kind of looking at this baby, and yet she's like kneeling in her own blood that had, you know, like this fluid that had come out. And it's just like, here's just how do you even describe it? And I mean, I know every human being came into the world this way, but just like, here's this thing that grew in me. And then all of a sudden here you are, and you're a person, and you're a mixture of like something from me and then something complete, like whatever consciousness is, that it's not from me, it's from somewhere else. It's from someplace deeper, you know? And like, and it's just like that kind of meeting. I think that one represents a lot of, I guess the juice still in spirituality for me is the paradox and of the amalgamation of our soul and our biology. This like, we are, like Jesus coming into the world, it says two things to us. One, it says we're not supposed to be anywhere else. There's a 14th century mystic named Meister Eckhart who says, if God's goal for humanity was heaven, then he would have never created the earth. Which is a great line. Because you think about it, you're like, if we're just supposed to go somewhere else, then why are we here? It's like, no, this is where we're meant to be. And if we're honest, here is very complicated. I mean, in my show, Say Yes, and in my book about it, I mean, one of the things I say is like, we all know life is a miracle. Like, we have the math for that. But there are days that, why are there days that the miracle sucks so bad? And if there's a giver of that miracle, does it have anything to say about the suckiness? Like you know, our sacred texts are filled with other women and men who wrote laments, who suffered extreme loss, who were confronted with unsolvable mysteries, and yet still are like, my heart yearns for you, God. So there's that. We're not supposed to be anywhere else, this human life. But then Jesus, just like in any kid, you know, one of the things as a parent is you look at your kids, and your job is to make sure to raise them so they don't become monsters in society. But like, people come into the world a certain way. They come into the world a certain way. I have 3 kids. They are a mixture of my wife and I, but they are very much their own person. They're their own people. And you and I and everybody listening, we came into the world a certain way too. Our environment definitely affected us, but there's a deeper part of us. There's a deeper part of Jesus, and Jesus illuminates that deeper part of us. And what Jesus's incarnation says is like, you're not supposed to be anywhere else than here, but you're also, who you are is anchored in something deeper. Father Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan friar, in his book describing what Franciscanism is, what's the practice of Franciscanism based off St. Francis. And he said his summary is like, this is the spiritual world is much, much larger than the physical world, but there's no way to access that spiritual world except through the physical world. And so what that's saying is like, hey, there's a much larger reality, but we can never see it except through the window of this reality. And we catch glimpses of it every now and then. Like, there is no mountaintop where you can go see God. You can't climb a mountain and then you turn a corner and there's like a floating deity. Like, I knew you were going to come here, you know, like, it's not like that. What even Jesus says is like, hey, you fed me when I was hungry. You gave me water when I was thirsty. You visited me when I was sick, et cetera, et cetera. And the people are like, when did we never saw you like that. And he's like, oh, when you did it to the least of these, you're doing it to me. He's saying like, in the act of love, in the act of loving your neighbor as yourself, you're loving God. And this doorway, some kind of portal, sliver of what's larger, we see a little bit of. You know, like, there's no way you'll never see God. You only can see God out of the corner of your eye your whole life. So at least that's my summation of my experience at 46. I'm like, you never get to see it full on. You just catch glimpses of it out of the corner of your eye your whole life. And so, man, that was a long answer. So that's what that image does to me and all of those kind of meditations. It really like, it just, cause I love the art that is throughout history. I just think we mostly have sanitized, and in order to give reverence for our sacred stories, we very sanitize them. And I actually have a whole chapter in the book, which is called Sacred. And it's just like, how do you make sacred art?
Yeah.
what is sacred in it. And it's saying we want to give reverence to something that was really meaningful. But what we do in giving reverence is we like put some clothes on the people and wash them off a little bit and put some gold leaf behind their head, because that's a way to honor them. But like what that does is we slowly dismiss our own biological complexity from sacred happenings. We go, that happened to those people. It would never happen to me. But really, it's happening right in the midst of all our, just all our farts. There we go.
Yeah.
I need to work this in somewhere, but like, there are two things that are hiding in every meeting, and one is being farts and the desire to never be wrong socially. Those are like the two things that are hiding.
You're talking about the sanitizing piece, which I think is really interesting in the dynamic. Like you have like little sections in here around vulnerability, unease, assumptions, breaking, need, fear. It's you don't find those themes in any other Advent related materials, or at least the ones that I have seen.
Yeah.
Why like address like kind of these deeper issues, the deeper issues of humanity, these things, breaking off the kind of the sanitizing story that we hear every year? Why dig deeper? What was on your heart to really push into these vulnerable, expressive areas?
I mean, I think partly it's just, if you ask these questions, you get into it. So I think there was just a natural occurrence or the path that went down. Yeah, I wasn't I wasn't trying to make a book about like birth pictures either. I wasn't like, hey, let's get as much amniotic fluid as we can in these pages. It just was like, it's a good question. I'm trying to think of how I can summarize it without going on forever. I think some of it is just like the religious institution culture that I grew up in had a really hard time with physicality. Never really honored bodies, never really didn't teach embodied spiritual practices. Just loved to live in its head is really what it was. And, specifically, and also like it said, female bodies are so sexy. Don't even be in a car with them. And they're not in a direct way, but it was very like skeptical that anything good came from a female body unless it was in marriage and then it was serving a man. That's kind of it. So there's a bit of like giving honor and wonder to how this all happens within bodies. And then I just like, I just think like, and I think there's another part of me in my journey is that where I grew up, like we were like, Jesus was God and man. And then we never talked about him as a man. We talked about him as, well, he could do that because he was God. But actually what really changed for me, partly was when I went through spiritual direction school and had some teachers, but partly it was like, and if it's okay, I don't really want to get into this because it's a really long thing, but like, there is a way in Philippians 2, when Jesus says like he totally laid down, like he humbled himself, became a man. What he also becoming human means he didn't know everything that was happening. I think there's this like built-in way of talking about Jesus. Like Jesus knew what was going to happen. He knew he was going to die on a cross, but no, like why he's crying why is he crying in the garden? Oh, it's going to be really painful. Yeah. People do. I get tattoos and they're really painful. Like he's crying in the garden because he doesn't know what is after dying. He doesn't know if he's going to resurrect. Nobody has ever resurrected. Why? That's not that. He's facing what it means to die. Part of being a human is living with, I don't know what's next. I don't know how this is going to turn out. But then like thinking about Jesus being a baby can't do anything for itself. It's so vulnerable. And I think, and it needs people. I think one of the last sections in the book is just like, if Jesus was fully human, it means he needed people, because you can't be a human if you don't need anybody. Being a human necessitates social interaction. You need people. So why is it so hard for us to imagine Jesus would need us? God would need us.
Yeah.
And then I think there's something deeper under there. It's just like this, I don't know if it's like American individualism. there's something, there's rugged, I don't need anybody, I can do it all myself. It's just, all I can say is it leads to, you can only start to understand it if your heart becomes tender. And so I think talking about these things is really to tender our hearts, and then just to kind of go, I don't know how to think about this. And it's that place that I don't want to move from. It's like, I'm not trying to solve it as much as just like get us to that space where I'm like, because it really is a mystery, and we're not going to figure it out. But that mystery between the paradox of God and man is what will transform us and soften us. And it's where we'll meet Christ. So I think it was, and even just in my own experience, being in a body, getting older, I'm like, and then my friend Hillary McBride wrote a great book, like The Wisdom of Your Body. And I've learned a lot about like spiritual practices that are embodied, like walking prayers, silence, solitude, these kinds of, even just before this, I know that I'm really close to burning out because I've just been doing a lot. And I've recently come to know that there's this like kind of this little great outdoor backyard sauna that these people put out. Like they have they have cold plunge pools. They have like a hot tub and then saunas, and you can pay and you can spend some time there and kind of work through it and get in touch with my Norwegian roots. But especially in wintertime, getting into hot water, cold water, hot room, that kind of stuff. I just went and did that because it refreshes me and stuff. And the whole time I'm there, I'm like practicing gratitude. I'm saying my prayers. I'm sitting in an ice bath that's very uncomfortable, and it's bringing up all the things I'm mad about or angry about. You know what I'm saying? It's like this embodied. I can't just like think through it. Like, I'm going to take out my journal and write this out. Sometimes you have to get into it, and you're like, oh, there it all is. And so those things have become much more apparent to me. And that, a spiritual life is involved with a physical life. And so, here's a story where there's a lot of physicality to it.
Yeah. That's cool. So in the book, you talk a lot around not only the Christmas story, but it's linked to the full kind of scope of the salvation story. Yeah. So like, as you were writing it, as you're painting these images, how did you think about kind of the full story, both life and death, in kind of the Christmas narrative? The
full story of like a human being, like,
the full story of like Jesus, coming to the earth through his humanity, through his divinity, all the way through death on the cross. There's seems to be this link between those two throughout the book. How are you thinking about kind of the Christmas story and the story of Easter kind of tied into one as you're thinking about creating this resource for us? Yeah.
I think the main touch point for that is in the book of Revelation of Jesus Christ. We always forget that that's the rest of that book. Yeah. So the revealing of Jesus is that he is the one who is, the one who was, and the one who is to come. And I have these three meditations on that line: the one who was, the one who is, the one is to come. And the one who was means, like John says, before all things were created through him, like he was there in the very beginning. So there's this intimate, there's this Christ knowledge in this bigger idea of the Christ, not just Jesus's last name, but this like the front facing aspect of an invisible God has been there and so cares. like, I think in that question, I'm like, our real question during Christmas is really like, who cares? Like, who cares about all of this? Who cares about our lives? Who cares about this world?
Right.
It's the who was. That's the one who cares.
Yeah.
That's the one who's arriving. And then the one in who is, and then kind of tying in like the breath and the ruach, and the ruach is this, and the spirit is the same word in Hebrew, and it's like the wind and the breath, and it's saying like our very being is like the name, almost like the name of God, Yahweh. And, like it's there, he's in the midst of this. And then the who is to come really just goes like, there's an aspect of Jesus that we don't know about, which is we'll meet this Christ who was transformed only when we're also transformed through death. And so how do we start? And I think in that one, I go, how do we start building a relationship with that Christ? We start by apprenticing ourselves to our own death, because when we have to consider that this life will end, that maybe there's, and look, this is not, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the me after death. In fact, this might be some funny for some leaders, but wait, we don't know each other or people listening, but like, it's actually been really helpful for over a decade for me to go, there's nothing after this, because a lot of my upbringing in institutional church just fully focused on heaven and afterlife. And which is fine, but I was like, that's all abstract. Nobody has any proof or knowledge of it.
Yeah.
And I think I realized in kind of my deconstruction, reconstruction, I was like, oh, I think people were obsessed with afterlife because they felt like their faith was insecure about this life. And so they pivoted to just talk about afterlife. And then like, do you know where you're going to go when you're going to die? And be like, who cares? I'll be dead. Do I know how to do this life? It's such a weird thing if you really get into it. But I am now, probably because I'm in my later 40s and I've had enough friends die already. But I'll just be like, if there is something after this, what will that be like? And who will be there? And I don't have a lot to say about that at this stage in my life. Though, and I say this in my show, Say Yes, at the very end, I go, whatever's after this, I don't know what it is, but I've experienced grace here, and I'm just going to assume that it's going to be there too. Because what I've also learned is that the major aspects of transformation in my faith, birth, death, rebirth, brother, are you born again? It's not up to me. You're not, you don't get to be in charge of being born. You're just born, and then you die. And then if you're reborn, you're not in charge of that either. These are all elements of our faith or in our life existence that we're not in charge of. They put us in the hands of God, which is also the hands of grace. And so I just trust in grace, because that's what I've come to trust in. But I think in that, it was like, if we're looking at, we know Jesus' story from history, so we know that he dies, and we know that he resurrects, and that he ascends. And ascension is a whole other animal, but but I don't get that in this book. I have that in another work of stuff that I've done. But like, it's an aspect of our life, and so it's going to be in there. I don't think I get into death too much, much as like, what does this say about this? But
the full scope of the story, right? I mean, it's the full scope. I read your book and think about the full scope of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, the whole scope of his life, which I think is an interesting, because a lot of times people don't do those two parallels together, right? The Christmas story and the story of Easter aren't always connected, which is a little bit of a travesty.
Oh man. They do. There's something to that where they almost feel like completely different people. With we just have one little like bridge of Jesus being 12 and getting lost and finding him at a temple. That's like the little kind of in between connector we have. It's like the young Indiana Jones Chronicles. We just have like little, we have a young Jesus Chronicles, and then the movie franchise.
That's right. That's right.
No one under 30 knows, or even 40. I don't know. The young Indiana Jones Chronicles does.
One of the things that I think that is interesting is kind of this regaining of the anticipation during Advent. I think so much of our historical literature, songs, art, things that we're reading historically have been about the anticipation, right? It's leading into the Christmas Day celebration, the whole thing. We've kind of lost, I think, some of that anticipation. And I think you bring that back in your book in some really cool ways.
Yeah.
I think the one thing that has blinded us around that has been our consumerism around the holiday. And
totally. I couldn't agree more.
What would you say to people around kind of the consumerism, the anticipation of Advent, kind of the process of it, like the full kind of scope of it?
I want to say it maybe whatever our questions are, they might not be solved the morning of the 25th. These are just ceremonies or rituals that we create to kind of give structure to things. I do think what we can do from the season, though, is, and as we contemplate what a pregnancy is, what a birth is, all these things that then happened around Jesus's birth to different people and stuff, is to go, am I paying attention to what's happening? And maybe definitely we'll take it metaphorically, but like what questions are pregnant in me? I've been learning and practicing like pilgrimage. And what that really all the differences, like just if I'll pose this, it's like two people could be at the same, temple in some far off country having completely different experiences because one person just got off a coach bus from their hotel and then is like seeing this thing and being like, this is cool. I'll take a picture and post it on Instagram. Somebody else could have been walking for 2 weeks with their questions and their hopes and their desires. And they get to this temple, this church, this basilica, whatever. And they're like, here, and they've been primed. So it really, the only difference, a pilgrimage is just really intention. If you give intention to your desire, your questions, what questions are you walking with? So we can use Advent as just going, well, am I holding questions? What are the questions of my life? What are the things that are interior? And would the God of this world and my interior world bring those two worlds together in some way I didn't see? And I would bet my money on, if you really take heart and bring those things. And I just recently went on a trip to Iceland and kind of had this mystical experience because I was doing that for like over a week, just like walking with my questions. Even though there's no like sacred shrines that man built, there's unbelievable like glaciers and volcanoes and crazy things there. But like I had this really intimate, private moment out on this beach where like it was the exterior world met my interior world, and I was filled with wonder and transformation. And I think that's kind of what the story of Advent is just like, here's this thing that's starting small, and then eventually it comes into the world and it changes all kinds of things for people. And yet the world is still going on and stuff like that. So we could use this just as kind of a model. And if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, you're seeing the exterior world lead you in that direction. The leaves are falling off the trees. The sun, it's getting darker. There's a seasonality to our spiritual practice that lets us uncover these things in us. Nobody wants to deal with the deep parts of their life in the summer when they're at barbecues. No, you're like swimming in, you're swimming and you're eating grilled hamburgers and you're doing all that fun stuff. Yeah. It's when it gets like dark and hard that you're like, oh, I'm going to dig in. Yeah. That's why. Yeah. I mean, I hope this isn't a news flash for everybody. Jesus was not born on December 25th, but the reason it is in our calendar on the 25th is because or the Christmas Eve is because it's 3 days after the solstice, meaning 3 days after the darkest day of the year. Just kind of like how Easter, Jesus went into the grave and comes out 3 days later. It is to go, the darkest spot, all of a sudden light is coming into the world. Like, you know what I'm saying? It's like it's I don't know who did it, but whoever came up with the calendar, church leaders at the time, it's very specific. They're building into something. They're building in something to go, oh, what does living in the world teach us? Oh, it can get really depressing at this time. What if we celebrated Christ incarnating in the world at the time? That's amazing, right? That's amazing that they did that. And we have that. I don't know what you do in Australia because you're at the beach and that you're just, it's obviously the church leaders were from the Northern Hemisphere. They didn't care. They didn't care about New Zealanders. So, that. So I have been like, when I went and sat this afternoon, I sat and I was like, what are my questions? I have questions about people who support me. And I was like, what am my relationship with them? Oh, I have so much gratitude. Oh, I want to bring them along on the journey with me. And I sat and I listened and I talked to God about it and was like, okay, anyways, that's the direction I would give. It's like, what are your questions that you're walking with?
Yeah. Cool. Well, Scott, hey, thanks so much for being on the pod. We really appreciate it. You can check out Scott's work on Instagram, on his website. All those links will be below in the description.
Send all of your feedback to Daniel. He'll answer all those questions for me. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for being on the pod. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. It was great.